Middle East, 1967. With lightning speed, the Israeli tankers charge into Sinai.
I had a feeling that nobody could stop us.
And slam into the massed ranks of the Egyptian Armored Corps.
It was a big mistake for them to believe that the Egyptian doesn't know how to fight.
At stake is the destiny of the Middle East.
They're willing to stand there, they're willing to duke it out with the Israelis.
2 armies, 6 days, and only one winner.
The fate of the war was in our hands.
This is the showdown in Sinai. This is the 6-day war. The desert borderlands of southern Israel. A hotly disputed corner of the Middle East, which has been torn apart by conflict. Born in the throes of violent warfare, to survive, Israel has had to learn to fight. And in the desert battles of the last 60 years, it's the tankers who've held the key to military success. From its creation in 1948, the modern state of Israel was besieged on all sides by hostile Arab neighbors, whose ambition was nothing less than its total and utter annihilation. The first Arab-Israeli War of 1948 was swiftly followed in 1956 by a second war against Egypt. And 10 years later, with the conflict still unresolved, Israel and Egypt begin to mobilize their armies once again.
Since the end of the Israeli War of Independence in 1948, the Israelis and the Arabs had constantly been pushing against each other. In 1967, all of this comes to a head. The crisis gets out of hand, Egyptian forces build up, the rhetoric on both sides escalates. It sets in train a series of events that ultimately make the war unstoppable.
As the battle lines are drawn along Israel's southern border in Sinai, Egypt can boast not only a numerical advantage, but also the superpower backing of the Soviet Union. By June of 1967, the Sinai bristles with Egyptian manpower and weapons. 100,000 men, 1,000 artillery, and more than 900 tanks.
The role of the tanks was extremely important in an open area like Sinai. In order to counter a tank, you need a tank. So it has to be tank versus tank.
Egyptian armor is overwhelmingly composed of a T-55 medium tank. It has good armor, a good gun, good mobility, and very rough and tumble in terms of being able to operate in the harsh climate of the desert.
The Soviet T-55. Weighing in at less than 40 tons, it's light, fast, and carries a lethal 100mm cannon. And its wide tracks make it ideal for the soft sands of the Sinai.
When you throw it all together, the T-55 is on balance a much better tank than what the Israelis have. The Israeli armored force is a hodgepodge, reflecting the fact that in 1967, Israel does not have a great power backer. The Israeli forces are using relics from the Second World War that they have collected from the scrapyards of Europe. They still have Centurions. They still have a few of the old Sherman tanks, but now there are American-made Patton tanks.
The M48 Patton medium tank, armed with a 90mm main cannon. It's more powerful than the Sherman, more reliable than the Centurion, and the best tank the Israelis can field. The only drawback is the crisis comes to a head in June of '67. The Israelis have far too few of them. Mobilizing along their southern border, the Israelis can only muster 700 tanks, 70,000 troops, and less than 200 artillery. Outnumbered, outgunned, and on the brink of war, Israel's only hope is to strike first and to strike hard. And out of the blue, on June 5th, that is precisely what they do.
It's fair to say that the Israeli did their homework very well, and the Egyptians were sleeping and were not ready at all.
In less than 3 hours, the Israelis destroy almost 300 planes on the ground, all but obliterating the Egyptian Air Force.
The Israelis, they have been training for this attack for almost 10 years, especially the airstrike attack.
For the Israeli tankers, the die is now cast. And at 8 o'clock, they launch their ground offensive. Their plan, a three-pronged attack blitzing into the Sinai. The northern arm, under General Israel Tal, aims to slam through the first line of Egyptian defenses at Khan Yunis and Rafah and reach El Arish, the northern gateway to Sinai.
Tal's order was, it doesn't matter how many casualties we get on the first day of the war. Whether we can communicate or not, we go forward, we shoot, and we charge. The fate of the war is in our hands.
I've decided to cross the border. And when I crossed the border, I realized that we are in the war. We drove between trees, and we couldn't move to the left and the right, and all the fire was straight to my face. After maybe 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, I lost my tank. I jumped to the second one, and after a few kilometers, I lost the second tank. And after that, I was the first Israeli tank in Khan Yunis, and they shot my tank from all over. They shot from every house, many soldiers all over. They tried to stop my tank, because I was the first Israeli tank, and behind me, nobody could protect me, support me. I found myself trying to protect myself, but it almost was mission impossible. I used my main gun. I shot some houses that I saw many soldiers waited for me there. We got an order before that not to shoot with the main gun to the houses. In this moment, I said, forget about that. I fought to survive. I didn't have any experience, and even my soldiers. And I was lieutenant, young officer, running all the time, first tank, all the time. This was my mission.
By 10 o'clock, Khan Yunis has fallen. Driven by the urgency of their commander, the Israeli tankers barely pause for breath. Their next objective, Rafah.
I had a feeling that nobody could stop us. A normal man is afraid. Even I was afraid. Everybody was afraid. But no one even thought about stopping. We kept on charging. We kept on charging.
I didn't see anybody in the first moment, but suddenly I saw a black line 1 kilometer in the front of me, and I didn't know what is that, the black line. I came close, and I saw tanks. At moment that I realized that we are in the middle of a division, and this is my mission now to attack them, of course.
June 5th, 1967. Day one of the Six-Day War. Israeli armored divisions strike first and crash through the Egyptian defenses in the Sinai. In the north, General Tal's division storms Khan Yunis and without stopping hurtles towards the Egyptian fixed defensive lines at Rafah.
So they realized that if they can move faster and think faster and make decisions faster than the Egyptians, they can constantly catch the Egyptians at a disadvantage.
Everything happened all of a sudden in one day or so. So it was a big surprise.
I realized that we are in the middle of a division, and this is my mission now to attack them, of course. In Rafah, I put all the tanks beside of my tanks, and it was the first time that I used all of them together. We couldn't stop because it go, 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 go all the time. People support each other, you know. It's some tanks stop for a moment, and other tanks move forward, and they cover each other.
Egyptian forces demonstrate a real capacity to fight from fixed defensive positions. It's what they're best at. They're willing to stand there, they're willing to duke it out with the Israelis. If you put them in a position where they feel comfortable, where they feel like they can fight back, they will fight back hard.
They build special places like fire position. They cover themselves with the dune, with the sand. And just the top of the third we saw. I remember one of them was 1 meter in the front of my tank, and I saw him. And of course we moved the gun and we shot him back. The enemy can be in shock when you don't stop. Even you lose some few tanks. Don't stop, move and move and move, and be behind him. We run so fast. When you stop, you are a good target. When they realize that they cannot stop us, they jump from the tunnel and they start to run away from us. And they took off the shoes and they threw away the rifles and they start to run to the ocean.
By noon, the Egyptian forward defensive line at Rafah is decisively breached. Reeling from the explosive speed of the Israeli advance, the Egyptian high command is in a state of denial.
The fog of war descends very heavily on Egyptian forces. It is humiliating for the Arab commanders to admit that the Israelis, that the Jews, are beating them. And so rather than admit that they're losing, they claim the exact opposite. They claim to be succeeding. They claim to be beating the Israelis back. And so when those Israeli formations that have now penetrated the Egyptian front lines begin to push into the deeper Egyptian positions, those Egyptians farther back are totally unready for them.
By early afternoon, the first Israeli units reach the Geradi Defile, a heavily fortified choke point on the road to El Arish, where they catch the Egyptians off guard.
I approached the Geradi. The Geradi is a narrow passage like the route to Jerusalem. This terrain is very difficult with soft dunes and landmines. So I decided to go back to the technique of moving in a column with 3 tanks shooting forward. The Egyptians began shooting at us from the right and from the left. We returned fire. We saw a few burning flames.
ואנחנו השבנו אש וראינו כמה להבות שדולקות.
I gave an order that every tank that is hit is moved to the side. They take out the crew and we continue moving. We won't bother with repairing tanks during this battle.
The first Israeli tanks break through the Geradi at breakneck speed. But for those following on behind, the element of surprise has been lost.
And as a result, when the main body of the Israeli force comes to the Geradi Pass, unlike its vanguard, they now face an Egyptian foe who is dug in, armed, and waiting for them.
I didn't know that a few hours before, 2 companies crossed the Geradi already. I didn't know that. Nobody told me that. Suddenly I saw 2 soldiers beside of the road. I looked to his faces. He was so fear and scared. And he said something like, "Be careful. You have many tanks here." Suddenly, it was a big bomb on the tanks.
June 5th, 1967. Israeli tanks smash through Rafah and charge into northern Sinai. The lightning speed of their attack catches the Egyptians off guard, and the lead tanks of General Tal's armored division punch through the Geradi Defile. But by the time the main body arrives, the Egyptians are ready and waiting for them.
Suddenly I saw 2 soldiers beside of the road, and he said something like, "Be careful. You have many tanks here." And I decided to move the main gun and put it in the direction that my gunner would try to identify them. And I moved down to talk with him and to give them the direction. At this moment, suddenly, it was a big bomb on the tank. At this moment, I say, bye-bye the world. Shalom to the world. And then I started to scream. All my body was on fire. 2 of my crew was killed. My deputy, that I was in his tank, and the loader, they were killed, both of them.
Outnumbered from the outset, the Israelis can ill afford casualties. And by mid-afternoon of day 1, their losses mount alarmingly.
I looked around and said to myself, seeing this, such a heavy price for the first battle, what is going to be next? My feeling after this battle was not fear, but worry. If this is how the war continues, we won't be able to carry on with so many wounded.
They found a real war in all aspects of the world, and they have to fight, and they have to suffer, and they lost lots of their men and their armored forces.
And the 7th Armored Brigade, the elite of the Israeli army, suffers its heaviest losses during that combat in the Geradi Pass. They just have to fight it out, yard by yard, pushing the Egyptians back. And there ensues one of the most ferocious fights of the entire Six-Day War.
We organized ourselves, and I got a mission to advance and conquer Girardi. We took control of the commanding terrain, and we started to hit the Egyptians that sat at the Girardi from behind. When a defending force sits in dugouts, in positions and bunkers, it was very difficult for it to change direction. We attacked tanks, cannons, and bunkers from the rear. That is what actually broke them.
אז למעשה זה למעשה ששבר אותם.
And then they started to flee, and that was the collapse of the Girardi.
נפילה של ג'יראדי.
Tal's division surges through the Girardi towards El Arish. But their momentum is so fast and so furious that their position is now dangerously overstretched. The Egyptians send their elite 4th Armored Division north to hit the Israelis hard in the flank. But racing through the desert to head them off where they least expect it is the second arm of the Israeli offensive under General Avraham Yaffe. South of the coastal roads, the Egyptians believe the trackless desert to be impassable to armored vehicles and impenetrable to tanks. But not to General Yaffe.
Our move was especially surprising because they didn't expect us to come from a direction they thought impassable. There were heavy dunes on the right side and heavy dunes on the left side, and we advanced on that pathway.
Now, the going's tough, and a lot of Israeli tanks do get stuck, and it is hard to get the forces through there. When Yoffe's forces get to the other side, they're strung out, they're piecemeal, they're a little bit helter-skelter.
And their task now is to intercept the Egyptian 4th Armored Division, which is advancing with hundreds of deadly T-55 main battle tanks.
This was a tank battle that was perhaps one of the biggest since World War II.
בתקופה אולי אפילו מלחמת העולם השנייה.
June 6th. In the north of Sinai, General Tal's divisions have breached the Egyptian front line. But now his flank is dangerously exposed. The tanks of General Yaffe's division speed through the desert in a race to head off a massive Egyptian counterattack. At Bir Lafan, the two sides come face to face. 200 Soviet tanks of the elite Egyptian 4th Armored Division against just 100 Israeli Centurions.
The Israelis have become expert at long-range gunnery. The superb guns on the Centurion allow the Israelis to engage the Egyptian forces at much longer ranges than the Egyptians realistically can.
We opened fire at a range of 1,500 to 2,000 yards.
The 52-ton British Centurion, in service since 1945, has been upgraded by the Israelis with a 105mm cannon, giving it more firepower and a greater striking range than the Egyptians' T-55.
you have better cannons and a good fire control system, and if you are trained well, then of course if you can hit from a bigger range than the enemy, it gives you a great advantage.
The Israelis have learned that the best way to kill tanks is not just by shooting them head on, but to get on their flanks, hit them in the side, hit them in the rear.
There is a saying in the armored corps that the best tank is the tank that has the best crew. Sometimes the crew is more important than the tank.
The combat itself is a swirling tank fight that plays to all of Egypt's disadvantages and all of Israel's advantages.
If you have tanks that are heavy, less to maneuver, slow, and countered by faster tanks, so more maneuvering, you're left laying back in the sand.
The Israeli tankers maneuver constantly. They dart from firing position to firing position. They get out on the Egyptian flanks. The Egyptians lumber forward clumsily in large formations that are very difficult for them to maneuver.
General Yafi's centurions destroy as many as 80 Egyptian tanks. The rest of them flee. But the Israelis still face their biggest challenge. Farther south at Abu Agila, the third arm of the Israeli offensive under General Ariel Sharon has an even tougher task: to crack open the massive Egyptian fortifications, defending the main axis of advance into central Sinai.
The Egyptians in 1967 are on the defensive. They have the advantage of being able to sit behind very well-developed Soviet-aided fortifications, trench lines, deep minefields, positions dug in depth, interlocking fields of fire, pre-registered artillery fire zones.
They're the heaviest fortifications in the whole of Sinai. The task of breaking through falls to Battalion Commander Nat Gainier.
Arik told me that he can't give me any artillery backup because I was too far from him, and that this mission would be on my own. All the trenches had been constructed to a Soviet design with cement walls. There were many tank battalions, a lot of infantry and artillery force. It was hard to find places to climb up the dunes without sleeping. They also had anti-tank missiles, and this was a problem. The first attack wasn't going our way. We lost many tanks.
It was a big mistake for them to believe that the Egyptian doesn't know how to fight.
I reassigned new people, company commanders. One company commander died, another was injured. 4 platoon commanders died. I was able to plan the best way to attack. You can only go up on the back of the dunes. Otherwise, you slip off them. I found a place where I would be successful. And then I conquered.
initial breaching operation is a tough one for the Israelis that costs them a great deal of the casualties that they take in the entire operation. But once they're through those fortified defenses, they are effectively free.
Their mission now, encircle and destroy the Egyptians' defensive stronghold at Abu Aguila, in what will become one of the most audacious maneuvers in the history of armored warfare. Central Sinai. The tanks of Ariel Sharon's division penetrate the Egyptians' formidable fortified defensive line. Their mission, to wreak havoc on the Egyptian stronghold at Abu Aguila.
Sharon's plan to deal with the Egyptian defensive system at Abu Aguila is to hit it from all sides. He pushes a battalion task force of armor through the soft sand dunes north of the Abu Aguila lines.
Their main weapon is surprise. And maneuvering in the dead of night, confusion reigns.
The Egyptian tanks that were sent against me got mixed up and got into my convoy. And by the sound of their engines, we knew they weren't Centurions. And the cannons were directed to the right or the left, depending on what side the Egyptian tanks were. And as we were driving, we left them on their own, shot them and destroyed them.
After hours of treacherous maneuvers in enemy territory, they ride into the Egyptians' unprotected rear.
They prepared for a frontal attack, straight in front of them, from east to west. They didn't think even for 1 second that tanks or vehicles can cross the dunes. So I passed through firing as we moved. I also turned around cannons to the right and cannons to the left, in 2 columns. I went into the area of their supply and command. It was like in a movie. You enter and they were surprised. And we shot with cannons and machine guns, and it all caught on fire. All of their supply, all of their fuel, the ammunition, everything. Their command headquarters, it was all burning. It all exploded. The entire place was on fire. When we finished one pass through, we turned around and came back.
But Nir's attack has alerted the Egyptian armored reserve, which in desperation throws itself into the fray.
Egyptian units tend to stick together, they will hold together, they will fight as units for long periods of time, even in very poor, even desperate circumstances, when other formations of other armies might fall apart.
Without knowing where we are, they just moved around like mice. And that was the end of them. The moment I felt something was there, we turned on the big projector for a few seconds, just so the gunner puts the cross on the target. You shoot one low, one high, and destroy the Egyptian tank. At night, suddenly we were 10 meters, 15 meters away from 6 tanks. 7 tanks. 4 times they tried to attack us. Their tanks caught on fire. We destroyed all of these attacks. When the tankers jumped out, they were burning like torches from their tanks. A horrible and terrible sight. At the same time, many of our projectors were being shot at and disabled. The Egyptians shot projectors that were turned on for too long a time. was a very difficult nut to crack. But thanks to the movement from the rear, it all began to collapse.
With the decisive Israeli victory at Abu Aguila, the Egyptians face defeat on all three fronts, and their command begins to panic.
Cairo realizes that the jig is up. And at that point in time, Field Marshal Amr makes one of the worst decisions in military history. He simply orders all Egyptian forces to retreat. And they should get back across the Suez Canal as quickly as they possibly can.
That was a disaster. That was the biggest disaster. And they received the order to withdraw in 24 hours, which is technically impossible. A good withdrawal technique should take at least 1 week. It should happen during the night.
The retreat becomes a rout. Huge numbers of Egyptian tanks flee westwards, only to find their escape route blocked by Israeli tankers. The Sinai, June 6th. In a space of less than 36 hours, the Egyptian tank divisions are routed by the Israelis, and they flee the battlefield. One of their main routes of escape lies through the Mitla Pass, leading to the Suez Canal and the safety of Egypt beyond. But in a headlong dash, the Israeli 200th Brigade gets there first.
Sitting at the mouth of the Mitla Pass is a tiny little armored force, no more than a dozen Israeli tanks, led by Bren Edan.
I gave an order to the 200th Brigade to send a battalion quickly to the Mitle and block them.
He has basically taken as many tanks as he could, run south as fast as he could, and every time they began to run out of gas, he'd siphon it out of the tanks to keep as many as he could running to get down to the Mitla Pass with this tiny little force. And there they engage in one of the great feats of long-range gunnery of the modern world. Using their long-range gunnery skills to keep the Egyptians at bay, they keep an enormous force of Egyptians from getting through the Mitla Pass until additional reinforcements are finally able to come up hours later and seal off the Mitla altogether.
Its escape route blocked, the Egyptian armor now falls easy prey to the Israeli Air Force. With the Egyptian army left reeling, the Israeli tankers press on through the Mitla Pass towards their ultimate prize beyond, the Suez Canal, and complete domination of the Sinai.
In the west side, what surprised me, that the Egyptian army was not in a situation of withdrawal. They just stopped their withdrawal there. I realized that I have a real enemy in front of me. I knew that from the terrain point of view, the maneuvering is going to be very difficult, so I must use something which is very fundamental in any war. This is surprise. I talked to all the tank commanders, and I told them, look, I'm going to do something which is unusual. With open lights, and we will go towards the Suez Canal. If we will face the enemy, we will shoot, we will fight. But it could be that the enemy will feel that it's Egyptian troop going, because otherwise they will not understand about the light. Just be ready with the guns to the right, to the left. The only one who will give you orders to shoot is myself. And we start moving, and you know, it was quiet. Nothing happened. All of a sudden, when the sun came up We were in the middle of a big deployment of armor and infantry, and it was a big surprise. I hold the fire. I said, don't shoot, because this army is a defeated army. I'm not going to start a massacre because both sides will suffer. Once they raise their hand, we won the battle without even one single shot.
It has taken the Israelis just 3 days to destroy the Egyptian army and reach the Suez Canal. Their conquest of Sinai is absolute.
It's fair to say the military leadership on the Egyptian part were not up to the challenge or up to the responsibility at all. The army was not really ready and trained and prepared to fight a war in Sinai against the Israelis. To lose it bad in 2-3 days, that was kind of humiliating.
In the course of a brief campaign, the Egyptians have lost more than 10,000 men and 700 tanks. For the Israelis, victory also comes at a price, with 1,400 casualties and more than 60 tanks destroyed. But for their tankers, the six-day war is nothing short of a triumph.
Israel's victory in the Six-Day War is one of the most stunning military accomplishments of the 20th century. A small Israeli force takes on a larger, better-equipped Egyptian force, dug in the right places in the Sinai Peninsula, and they not just defeat it, they destroy it.
We knew there wasn't any other option. Either you win or you die. There is no middle way. There is nowhere to retreat. There is no place to escape.
Outgunned and outnumbered, a small but highly trained Israeli tank force has proved to be unstoppable.
The tank's qualities are important, but they are not the main issue. The saying goes, it's not the steel that counts, but the men that's driving the steel.
October the 6th, 1973. Hundreds of Egyptian tanks surge across the Suez Canal in a bold and shocking surprise attack on Israeli forces.
The desert is moving like earthquake.
Determined to avenge their humiliating defeat in the Six-Day War of 1967, Egypt strikes deep into the Sinai Desert.
What has been taken by force has to take it back by force.
The Israelis, caught off guard and outnumbered almost 5-1, find themselves in a desperate fight for survival.
They're facing a very different Egyptian army. This time, they're in for a very rude awakening.
Two mighty tank forces clash in an epic 18-day battle. A battle that will determine the fate of the entire Middle East.
There is no retreat. We have only one alternative: victory.
The Sinai Peninsula, a vast desert in western Egypt, separating Israel and the Egyptian heartland. It is one of the most lonely and desolate places on the planet. But in 1967, this was the stage for one of the swiftest and most dramatic victories in the history of warfare. 5th, 1967. Israel launches a preemptive strike against Egyptian forces massing along its border and catches them completely off guard. In less than a week, Israeli forces seize the entire Sinai Peninsula, and they dig in, building fortifications all along the Suez Canal. For the Egyptians, it is a humiliating blow.
Someone came to my house, take half of it. Can you live with someone in your house, bother you every day and tell you what you're gonna do about it? And this is the day when we decide to do something about it.
As soon as the 1967 war ends, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser begins completely rebuilding his battered army.
It took Egypt a good 6 years of training, of straight, hard training, restructuring of all the system in the army.
By the fall of 1973, it is a force of over 300,000 well-trained men, 2,000 artillery pieces, and 2,400 tanks. But it will take more than just men and machines to beat the battle-hardened Israelis.
The Egyptians know that they need to catch Israel by surprise. The Egyptians develop a plan. They develop one of the most remarkable deception campaigns of the last 100 years. They practice forming up their units, driving to the canal, and then they practice the canal crossing itself. And they do it over and over and over again. So that over the course of time, the Israelis just come to expect it. It just becomes a part of the scenery.
Beyond that, the Israelis have grown complacent in their defensive positions and believe the Egyptians pose no serious threat.
Since the Six-Day War, after such a famous victory, the Israeli army became to be too arrogant.
They believe something that wasn't true. They believe that the Egyptian doesn't know how to fight, or the Arab doesn't know how to fight and will never fight successfully.
In October 1973, all the Israeli Defense Force has to defend its 200-kilometer Sinai front are 18,000 men, 100 artillery pieces, and less than 300 tanks. A tiny defensive force, woefully ill-prepared for battle. And on October 6, 1973, Egypt and their Syrian allies launch an immense two-front offensive against Israel. In the opening hours of the attack, Israeli forces are quickly routed. On the northern front, masses of Syrian armor steadily advance into the Golan Heights. And on the Sinai front, the situation for the Israelis is even more desperate.
My brigade was the only brigade along the Suez Canal responsible for a front of 200 kilometers. Egyptian aircraft were bombing. 2,200 artillery guns were firing ammunition. The feeling was is the desert is moving like earthquake. I had 88 tanks and 850 Egyptian tanks were crossing the Suez Canal.
The tanks bearing down by the hundreds on Reshef and his men are Soviet-designed T-55s. At 36 tons, the T-55 is relatively small, but it can move at up to 50 kilometers per hour and is armed with a 100-millimeter main cannon, providing a perfect balance of speed and deadly firepower.
immediately, we had our first casualties over there. We tried to avoid them from crossing, but the ratio between their forces and our forces are unthinkable.
In response, the Israelis send their elite air force to smash the advancing Egyptian invaders.
The Israelis, they always depend on their quick and effective airstrike. So the first lesson the Egyptians consider is how to eliminate the Israeli airstrike by surface-to-air missile, by creating what we call the wall, okay, a rocket wall. In the first 2 days, the Israeli Air Force lost more than 1/3 of its airplanes, so they decided to stop any airstrike at all.
With the Israeli Air Force neutralized, the Egyptians can begin the most difficult and dangerous phase of their operation, the crossing of the Suez Canal.
The minute you just see the canal, you can just have tears, because it was just a great feeling that you get this piece of land back.
The Egyptian crossing of Suez is an absolutely brilliant military operation. They have figured out every aspect of the canal crossing. They know that the Israelis are reliant on these huge sand barriers to try to keep the Egyptians away, and they develop high-powered water hoses that allow them to effectively just spray holes using water to erode the sand and cut passages through these Israeli sand berms.
The Egyptian operation has gone like clockwork. And in the first 18 hours of the attack, they send 90,000 men and 850 tanks across the Suez Canal. By the end of the day, the Egyptians have advanced almost 8 kilometers into the Sinai. Now all that stands between the Egyptian invasion force and the Israeli heartland are a couple of hundred tanks, most of which are just arriving on the battlefield as part of the IDF's armored reserves.
The Israeli armored reserves in Sinai immediately do what they have been trained, taught, ordered to do: counterattack. This time, they're in for a very rude awakening.
October 6, 1973. After a massive artillery barrage and wave after wave of airstrikes, hundreds of Egyptian tanks surge across the Suez Canal and storm into the Israeli-occupied Sinai Desert.
The feeling was is the desert is moving like earthquake.
The handful of Israelis defending the 200-kilometer front are caught off guard and quickly overwhelmed. And by the end of the day, the Egyptians have advanced 8 kilometers into the Sinai. Desperate to staunch the Egyptian invasion, Israel calls up its armored reserves, and by October 8th, they are ready to strike back.
The Israeli armored reserves in Sinai immediately do what they have been trained, taught, ordered to do: counterattack.
The Israeli plan calls for the lead elements of their reserve forces, 100 tanks strong, to attack straight into Egyptian positions, break up their formations, and force them back across the canal. Leading the 217th Reserve Armored Brigade against Egyptian positions near the Verdun Bridge is Colonel Natki Nir.
The next day, on the 8th, I received an order to move southward and to attack. On my left, another tank brigade was supposed to attack. But when I got my orders to attack towards the Verdun, there were no forces on my left. When we approached to about 600 meters from the direction of the canal, we encountered an inferno of shelling. A tank division and an infantry division with tanks were already on our side of the canal. They sat on our sand ramparts, on our side of the canal, and hunted us. We started the attack without artillery, without air support, and the whole attack depended on tanks. It was the first time we understood that the Egyptians were equipped with thousands of Saggier missiles.
The AT-3 Saggier is a Soviet-designed portable anti-tank guided missile. Fitted with a 2.6-kilogram warhead, the Saggier can penetrate 200 millimeters of armor at ranges up to 3 kilometers. But its most deadly feature is a wire guidance system, which allows the operator to steer the missile all the way to the target.
The operator has an optical sight, and he concentrates on the target, fires the missile, and using a joystick, literally direct the missile onto the target at distance. It's effective, and it allows Egyptian Saggier operators to fire volleys of missiles with a fairly good hit rate, so that the small numbers of Israeli tanks that are charging at them wind up suffering heavy casualties, much heavier than they had ever expected.
The battalion faced mainly Saggier missiles. They did a job on my brigade. I gave an order to retreat. This is the only time in my life that I gave such an order. Out of the approximately 22 tanks, 6 got out, and the rest were all destroyed. This was a different army. This was not the same army I fought against in the 6-day war.
They crushed the Israeli counterattack on October 8th, crushed it completely.
This is an unbelievable victory by the Egyptians, something that they have never achieved beforehand, and it is a stunning reversal for the Israelis.
By nightfall on October 8th, Egyptian forces have widened their bridgehead almost 10 kilometers into the Sinai. The ferocity and magnitude of the attack has forced most of the Israelis back, but a few remain trapped deep behind Egyptian lines.
We came to the conclusion that we have to try to evacuate the people from this position on the Suez Canal. The problem was that between this position and us, there were 5 reinforced infantry division with about 1,500 tanks. We moved. My tank was the left one, Shaul was next to me. When we entered in, the Egyptians opened fire. I saw Saggiers moving towards my tank. So you see a kind of fireball moving towards you. And when I saw a missile coming to me, I was breaking my direction. And they missed my tank. And on my tank there were some cables of the Saggier. After 2-3 minutes, I saw a group of 30 people on one of the dunes. And when I came to the range of 100 meters or so, I realized that they were Egyptian. And then I had my own personal fight, because it was either them or me. I used my machine gun, grenades, and then I had to go over them with my tank. And I killed all these 20 people. Then I realized that I was by myself. I took my binocular, watching, and I saw a monster moving. A gun and something undefined. And then I realized that there were soldiers on a tank. Shaul took all the 33 of them on his tank and moved out.
With their frontline soldiers rescued, the Israelis fall back to defensive positions near the strategically important passes through the Sinai Mountains.
From the 9th, a new phase begins, in which we are on the defensive, without any offensive intentions. Not to seek contact, but to rebuild our force.
As the Israelis pause to regroup, the Egyptians prepare for an enormous armored offensive, one they hope will drive their enemy out of the Sinai for good. October 14th, 1973. In just over a week, Egyptian forces have pushed 10 kilometers deep into the Sinai and easily repel every Israeli attempt at counterattack.
On the southern front of the October War, the Egyptians are doing well. Their cross-canal operation has worked. They've pushed into Sinai, but they have a problem. Their ally, Syria. Syria is not experiencing the same degree of success. Syrian forces have not only failed to secure their objectives on the Golan, but the Israelis are now smashing them.
Hoping to draw Israeli forces away from their Syrian allies, the Egyptians launch a massive armored offensive in the Sinai. Their plan, attack with 2 armored divisions in a gigantic pincer movement, aimed at smashing the Israeli forces guarding the passes through the Sinai Mountains. At first light on October 14th, 1,000 Egyptian tanks advanced towards Israeli lines.
When the Egyptians renew their offensive on October 14th, the attack that they launch is the absolute antithesis of the attacks that they had launched on October 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th. This time around, they don't have that same plan. The Egyptians simply lumber forward in the kind of clumsy frontal assaults that they had been famous for in '67. And this time around, the Israelis are waiting.
We received an alert that on the 14th, the 21st Egyptian Armored Division will cross the canal and try to advance and capture territory.
Very early in the morning, we were under a terrible artillery fire.
When the smoke cleared, the first tanks of the brigade that were opposite us were already upon us. First of all, we knew they were coming. We waited for them.
I saw hundreds of tanks moving forward. Tsunami. A huge wave moving towards you, and I said, oh God, how can I stop them?
It is like a Wild West duel. The first to draw stays alive.
They moved into fire position. And we fired on one tank after the other.
Every tank was behind camouflage on a hill, and only the guns were sticking out. From the start, in such a situation, when they are in motion and we choose the firing positions, that gives us a huge advantage.
Here is the case where our quality, gunnery quality, is important.
One of the Israelis' main battle tanks is a modified version of the American M48 Patton, known as the Magach. It is well protected with 120 millimeters of frontal armor and has a 105 millimeter cannon that can accurately hit targets at ranges of up to 3.5 kilometers.
The superb guns on the tanks that the Israelis are deploying in Sinai allow them to begin hitting and killing the Egyptian tanks long before the Egyptians are able to start destroying Israeli tanks. The Israelis have become expert at long-range gunnery.
We were fighting very accurately, aiming and destroying tank by tank. All the Egyptian tanks were in the area which was dominated by us, were destroyed.
Within simply a matter of hours, the entire Egyptian attack has been completely unhinged.
And they lost in this one day around 250 tanks. We felt the first time that we can make it.
For the Egyptians, the promise of victory now gives way to the reality of defeat, and Sadat orders his battered armored divisions to fall back to defensive positions. But these positions are vulnerable. When originally formed, the Egyptians left a dangerous gap between their Second Army and the Great Bitter Lake.
Israel is now ready to grab the initiative and go back on the offensive. And they use this piece of information, this gap, this seam, to plan their counteroffensive. The Israeli plan is to get to the canal, cross over it, to get behind the Egyptian formations, and to be able to tear them up from the inside out.
October 14th, 1973. In an effort to finally achieve victory in the Sinai, Egyptian forces launch a massive armored assault, over 1,000 tanks strong, against the Israeli defenders. But in less than a day, the Israelis destroy 260 enemy tanks, forcing the Egyptians to pull back towards the Suez Canal. But the Egyptians have left a gap in their lines, giving the Israelis an opening to advance to the canal.
The Israeli plan is get to the canal, cross over it to get behind the Egyptian formations and to be able to tear them up from the inside out.
Before the Israelis can cross the canal, they must secure their flank against the Egyptian Second Army, positioned a few kilometers north in a small agricultural area called the Chinese Farm.
We didn't know exactly where the enemy positions were located. When I entered into the area which was north to the Chinese farm, I realized that I am in hell.
The Israelis perhaps have bit off more than they could chew, because they're in the midst of not only a heavily reinforced Egyptian infantry division, they're also in the middle of an Egyptian armored division.
Hundreds of Egyptian soldiers were firing. There were tanks, anti-tank gun, a lot of action. I was fighting against two divisions. The ratio was unthinkable. So I was firing with my machine gun, grenades, with my cannon. I realized that I am in hell. We were all these hours under such a pressure of Egyptian tanks, infantry, everything. We could see a wave of tanks trying to recapture the positions that we already captured. After about half an hour, I saw 5 tanks in the range of 50 meters. When they came to the range of 30 meters, I realized that they are Egyptian tanks. And we fired 5 very high-speed rounds, pack, 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 pack. We destroyed all the 5 tanks. We fought all the night with Egyptian units and tanks. The range between the Egyptian tanks and my tank was sometimes half a meter, meter. Fire, darkness, blood. There is no better description like the real hell. I lost 121 soldiers and a lot of commanders in that terrible night.
The Battle of Chinese Farm will go on to last another 3 days, and when it's finally over, hundreds of destroyed Israeli and Egyptian tanks litter the battlefield. The heavy price paid by the Israelis clears the way for a task force to advance to the canal. And they immediately begin work on building a bridge. But the Egyptians quickly react.
The Egyptians finally found the bridgehead, and that's when the inferno began. The bridgehead went up in flames. Everything was burning.
It has been 11 days since Egypt launched a massive offensive into the Israeli-occupied Sinai. After hundreds of tanks are destroyed and thousands of men killed. On October 17th, the Israelis are finally ready for their attack into Egypt. Their plan, using temporary bridges, send 3 armored divisions across the Suez Canal and into central Egypt, where they can attack Egyptian forces from the rear and even threaten the capital of Cairo.
I understood that if Grand Division will not cross the canal and we will not be in the other side of the canal in Africa or Egypt, we will lose the war. All what we have done, gone. By 4 p.m., I told everyone, the bridge is ready, go ahead.
The Egyptians at this stage were in complete shock.
And the Egyptians started to understand it was a raid.
The Egyptians finally found the bridgehead, and that's when the inferno began.
Hell started, and the devil started to walk. In this operation where we lost more than 100 people, it was under heavy fire all the way.
The bridgehead went up in flames. Everything was burning. From the heavy shelling, people were buried alive.
There was very heavy fire. Egyptian helicopters dropped barrels full of explosives.
People were dying, were injured. And that was a real hell. It was the longest night ever in my life. I was not afraid to die. I was afraid if this mission will not be accomplished. And we succeed.
The Egyptian response to Israeli tanks on the western banks of the canal is both immediate and lethal. Their plan, attack from the south with a massive armored column aimed at cutting off and trapping the Israelis.
The Israelis, they have to go between the 2 Egyptian armies for a long distance, for like 50 or 60 kilometers, and became very vulnerable to any Egyptian attack.
For the attack, the Egyptians send their elite 25th Armored Brigade, 100 of their most modern Soviet-designed tanks, straight into the vulnerable rear of the Israeli bridgehead. October 17th, 1973. After 11 days of bloody fighting, Israeli forces finally fight their way across the Suez Canal and begin their invasion of Egypt. Desperate to stem the flow of Israeli tanks across the canal, Egypt counterattacks with its elite 25th Armored Brigade. Their plan is to push north in a massive armored column and destroy the Israeli rear guard, cutting off Israeli forces west of the canal.
A brand new brigade armed with the most advanced Soviet T-62 tanks is now pushing northwards along the Great Bitter Lake. Bren-Adan turns southward and hustles down with his division, puts them in place in an L-shaped ambush.
The first position of our tanks was about 3 kilometers from the canal. They were camouflaged, so the Egyptians couldn't see them.
Advancing straight into the ambush are 100 Soviet-designed T-62 tanks. In 1973, the T-62 is considered one of the best tanks in the world. It is well protected with over 100 millimeters of frontal armor and carries a 115 millimeter smooth-bore cannon, a powerful and deadly accurate main gun that can easily destroy an Israeli tank, especially at close range.
But I don't want our men to move. I don't want the Egyptians to feel anything. I want them to enter the zone of destruction.
Once the entire Egyptian brigade entered the ambush area, I gave the order to fire.
Natke set their tanks on fire, one after the other. The Egyptians, I can see the battle. The Egyptians tried to counterattack from the top to bottom. They didn't have a chance.
They tried to fire several shots, but listen, the ambush was lethal. After 2 hours, there were a few tanks left that tried to escape.
It was a big mess. Some of them drove back towards the Bitter Lake and they ran into a minefield.
In 2 hours, we destroyed the Egyptian 25th Brigade. Almost all of it. 5 tanks were able to escape back. After we finished this ambush, I told my division commander to erase the Egyptian 25th Brigade from the enemy territory.
With the destruction of the 25th Brigade, the Egyptians lose any hope of stopping the Israeli advance into the Egyptian heartland. By the next morning, the Israelis have elements of 2 armored divisions, almost 200 tanks west of the Suez Canal. By October 24th, the Israelis have advanced to within 100 kilometers of Cairo and have encircled the 3rd Egyptian Army.
The Israelis have done what they need to do. They have the Third Army trapped, and they know that that is the most important bargaining tool that they need to bring the war to an end on their terms. And so they agreed to a ceasefire.
It would take another 5 years of negotiations before Israel finally returns the Sinai to Egypt. For the Egyptians, it is a great victory.
The anniversary is a moment to remember our dignity that was retrieved in '73, honor the people who worked hard for 6 or 7 years to make this victory happen.
Anwar Sadat gets everything that he wanted. The Sinai is returned to Egypt, and Anwar Sadat is seen by the Egyptian people as the great victor of Harb al-October, of the October War, the man who regained Sinai for Egypt.
But Egypt is not alone in declaring victory, as Israel has its own cause to celebrate.
They attacked us, and we won in the most difficult possible conditions. The Egyptian army was crushed.
The fight that Israel underwent in 1973 is a great victory for Israel, but it is a traumatic experience.
We had nearly 3,000 casualties in this war. For us, this is an enormous number.
There's no Israel after 1973 who wants to go through that again. And that convinces Israel, too, that the best answer to their situation with Egypt is to simply make peace.
The Golan Heights. In 1973, this rocky terrain on the Israel-Syria border turns into a killing ground.
The Golan Heights is Syrian territory, and Syria cannot, will not concede it.
A few hundred unprepared Israeli tankers come face to face with 1,200 Syrian tanks.
All I see, from horizon to horizon, the entire Syrian army starts to drive across from me.
This was a no-holds-barred fight, and neither side backed down from it.
The Golan Heights. 1,200 square kilometers of the most hotly contested real estate on the planet.
It's Dante. It's inconceivable. It's an inferno.
The Golan Heights. 1,200 square kilometers of the most hotly contested real estate on the planet. It's a barren, volcanic escarpment that has been occupied by Israel since the Six-Day Arab-Israeli War of 1967. Both Israel and Syria claim it as their own. In the fall of 1973, that border dispute erupts into a sudden, ferocious, and bloody war. October 6th. It's Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement. Most Israelis are at home, repenting for their sins and observing a fast, leaving the frontier with Syria lightly guarded. The commander of the 74th Israeli Tank Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Yar Nafshi, begins a routine patrol.
It was simply pastoral peacefulness, and I am patrolling the positions along my front. At 12, a commander from the Hermon post calls me, and he says, "Yair, the Syrians are taking off their camouflage nets from their artillery." And then I act instinctively. So I turn my jeep around and gather all my men and say to them, "Look, the scenario is that the Syrian army is removing their camouflage screens. I don't know what this means." And the men stop fasting, mount their tanks, and start to prepare them. And as we are driving from the lots, the bombardment starts. artillery lands on us, then planes of the Syrian Air Force attack.
The Syrians have been planning the attack for 9 months. Israeli intelligence had some clues, but for the men on the front, it's a complete surprise.
What these Syrians do is lull Israel into a false sense of security. The Israelis have seen the Syrians move all their troops up, get geared up for war, time and again, only to have them all go back to their bases. And so on the 6th of October, when the Syrians don't go back to their bases, the Israelis are caught completely off guard.
Israel is a small state, and they have perfected the art of mobilization. So it is in the first shots of the war that you want to accomplish as much as possible, so as not to bring the bulk of the Israeli army against you.
The majority of the Israeli forces are reservists who need 20 hours to fully mobilize. Consequently, Israeli forces on the Golan Heights consist of fewer than 6,000 light infantry, 60 artillery pieces, and 2 under-strength armored brigades with 170 tanks. In comparison, the Syrians have massed more than 50,000 infantry, 600 artillery pieces, and 1,200 main battle tanks.
This is a huge amount of armor. And over and above that, it was Yom Kippur in Israel. People were on holiday. The intelligence services in Israel were lax. The Arabs can't fight. And so, as a result, they were in for a very major surprise.
I thought to myself, what's going on? Who are those pilots, crazy pilots, what they're doing? And I thought this is Israeli by mistake, they are bombing us. I didn't realize that any aircraft from Syria can come across the border and start to bomb us. And I couldn't talk after that.
I cross through the barrage of shells, wave after wave. In 5 minutes, I'm finally at the edge of Booster Ridge, viewing over half the Golan Heights. At first, it's small. And then, like rings of cigarette smoke, it slowly gets closer, bigger and bigger. And all I see, from horizon to horizon, the entire Syrian army starts to drive across from me.
But this is only part of a much larger war. Egypt and Syria have launched simultaneous attacks on 2 fronts, splitting Israeli defense forces. Their mission? To take back territory lost during the 6-day Arab-Israeli War, including the Sinai and the Golan Heights.
The Syrian body politic was humiliated, was traumatized. It is as a result of this that we had the 1973 war, a war that was made specifically in order to regain this territory that Israel occupied.
Over the course of time, they developed a campaign plan that was specifically tailored to retake the Golan and repair Syria's tarnished honor.
The Syrian battle plan is to use overwhelming force and penetrate the Israeli line at 2 points. Then send armored divisions through the gaps to advance across the Golan Plateau and seize key bridges over the Jordan River. At the spearhead of the Syrian attack are masses of the Soviet-designed T-55 tank. The T-55 at 40 tons is relatively small for a main battle tank, making it hard to hit. Its 100mm main cannon has an effective range of just 2,400 meters, no match for the bigger guns of the Israelis. But that disadvantage is offset by numbers. The Syrians attack the Golan Heights with more than 1,200 T-55s. The defending Israelis with their 170 tanks are outnumbered, almost 7 to 1.
The Syrians had rehearsed the initial attack on the Israeli positions countless times beforehand. But apparently, one thing that they hadn't quite planned out properly was where to put the bridging equipment. The Israelis had built a deep anti-tank trench in front of their positions all along the Golan front. But the Syrians had put their bridging equipment far back in their columns. And as a result, the first thing that happened was you had Syrian tankers who bizarrely drove straight at the Israelis, drove right into the tank ditch, and as a result were picked off like sitting ducks by Israeli tankers sitting up on the heights overlooking this anti-tank trench.
For the Israelis, the tank of choice on the rocky terrain of the Golan is the Canal, an upgraded version of the Centurion main battle tank. It's protected by 152 millimeters of frontal armor and equipped with a 105 millimeter rifled cannon, accurate at ranges in excess of 3,600 meters. The Canal is a formidable opponent to the Syrians' T-55s.
When David goes out to fight Goliath, he made a decision to fight him with a slingshot. And he knew he could defeat Goliath because he wouldn't enter in range of Goliath's weapons. And from outside that range, he hits him with a rock and knocks him over. I am going to be David. The Syrians don't open fire from ranges further than 2,200 meters, but I, in all my training, can fire and hit targets at about 5 kilometers.
The Israelis understood that in the terrain of the Middle East, where you often had very long fields of fire, being able to kill the other guy before he could kill you was a tremendous advantage. And so the Israelis had put a tremendous amount of effort into developing long-range gunnery skills. When the initial Syrian attack in the north floundered, the commanders decided that they would nevertheless try to mount some kind of a night operation to see if they couldn't get back on schedule. And so they pushed forward in the darkness. And at that moment, they had a tremendous advantage. The Syrian tanks had Soviet night fighting equipment. The Israelis didn't. And as a result, when the Syrians began to push into their lines, the Israelis were at a complete loss as to what to do or how to do it.
The hardest combat was during the night. It was dark and nobody used any lights. When you turn on the lights, immediately they kill you. Really, the main problem is during the night, they had infrared system.
Syrian infrared projectors enabled the T-55s to see through the dark, detecting targets up to 1,200 meters away. It's a huge advantage for the Syrians. The only defense the Israelis have are night vision binoculars that can detect the infrared beam.
One situation, I was looking to identify them, and I moved my face down, and I saw all the parts of my tank. I was surprised, what is dark? I moved my binocular, and I saw it's dark. I put it again in my face, I saw every part. And I and 200 meters in front of me, one projector looked straight to my eyes with infrared system. And he identified me, he was ready to shoot. And I screamed to my driver, go far away, and we moved back. We shot to the direction they came from, just to give them the feeling that we are there waiting for them. They didn't know that we are blind.
The Syrians infiltrate Israeli positions through the night, and the line between the two tank armies becomes increasingly blurred.
My situation, I saw a tank beside my tank, 10 meters. The tank looks strange, and the stoplights turn on. I talked to the platoon leader. He was close to my tank. He said, there is a tank here, use the light and show me who is this tank. He didn't want first, of course, and I convinced him, I ordered him. And he put the lights and I saw T-55. I was in shock. Of course I shot him. At this moment when he was on fire, I saw another tank close to him. I shot him too.
After 18 hours of almost continuous combat, the tankers of the 77th and 74th Israeli battalions have held the line in the North Golan Heights and pay a terrible price. Hundreds of dead and wounded, and 75 of their tanks destroyed. But for the Syrians, the price is even higher. The casualties number in the thousands, and more than 100 tanks are lost. But in the open terrain farther south, the Syrian offensive has been far more successful. They've wiped out an entire tank battalion, clearing the way for a push into the Israeli heartland.
Of course, I was as euphoric as all Arabs were to see images of Syria advancing in the Golan Heights.
The future, not just of Israel, but of the whole Middle East, now hangs in the balance. October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria attack Israeli forces on two fronts. They're determined to take back all the territory they lost in the Six-Day War of 1967. Syrian armored brigades strike at 2 points on the Golan Heights, throwing 50,000 infantry and 1,200 tanks into the battle. In the rugged and hilly northern sector, Israeli defenders hold the line through the first day of fighting, even though they're outnumbered almost 7-1 and take heavy casualties. But in the more open country farther south, the Syrians seem unstoppable.
In the south, you had two very aggressive Syrian commanders. They dragged their bridging equipment forward. One of their commanders actually had his infantry fill in portions of the Israeli anti-tank trench by hand. They crossed over, and they were able to mass so much power against these thinned-out Israeli defenses in the southern flank of the Golan that they were able to punch through.
October 7th. After a day of fierce fighting, the Israeli southern line falls apart under a massive onslaught of Syrian armor. By 8 a.m., Syrian forces are advancing across the Golan Plateau, driving towards key bridges crossing the Jordan River.
The Syrian assumption was that if they could punch through those Israeli lines and drive as fast as they could, grab those bridges, they would effectively be able to prevent Israeli reserves from mounting a viable counterattack out of Galilee.
At 2 o'clock, when I heard the alarm, I opened immediately the radio. I heard the BBC announcing that the war started in Israel.
A heavy battle of armed forces is continuing on the Golan Heights, as Syrian armor has been attempting to break the Israeli line and has, according to the news here, been checked by Israeli tanks and artillery.
I called my unit, the brigade, and they told me, come immediately, there is a war. The roads were empty, I drove like a hell, and the feeling was that they caught us unprepared.
In 73, the tanks were bare of ammunition and equipment. They had to be loaded with shells and all of the equipment taken out of storage and organized.
Again, if you have the full crew, which are 4 members, it takes something like 4 to 6 hours to prepare it really properly. But during the rush time, we didn't really prepare properly the tanks.
Everybody went to the Golan Heights, doesn't matter how many tanks he had, if the tanks are completely equipped or not. They just went.
Syrian intelligence estimates it will take Israel 20 hours to mobilize its tank reserves, but the Israelis do it in 10. Throughout the night, Israeli reservists make their way to the battlefield, are hastily organized into units, and thrown into the fight against the Syrians. By the early hours of October 7th, the first tanks reach the Golan Heights.
In the early morning, we advanced towards the enemy already inside the Golan Heights. Dawn was beginning to break, and we saw lots of tanks. A mask of sorts came down. Now we have to do what is necessary. You don't think about it too much. We opened fire on them, but directional alignments are required to match the barrel of the cannon to the cross of the telescope. But we didn't do this because of our hurried exit. We didn't hit them. It is possible to make battle time alignments, but this is a lot less precise. But it's better than nothing. We hit a few tanks. But not long after this, I saw a very large cloud of dust coming from the southeast. And when this cloud got closer, it turns out that it was a very large Syrian force with T-62 tanks.
It's the last thing the outnumbered Israelis want to see on the battlefield. The T-62 is an upgraded version of the T-55. Those upgrades include 240 millimeters of frontal armor and a bigger 581 horsepower engine. But the biggest threat is the T-62's 115 millimeter Molot main cannon. Its smooth bore design increases muzzle velocity, giving it a range of nearly 3,000 meters.
And then I honestly started to feel that I was being targeted, and shells are falling beside me or behind me. And if the first one is long, the next shell will be short, and then the next will hit me. So I reverse off the firing ramp and look for a new position. We started the battle with maybe 5 or 6 tanks against this very large Syrian force. All that was left for us to do was try to fight a stalling battle, but they simply pushed us backward.
It's overwhelming. 4 Syrian brigades, 350 tanks, push through Israeli defenders and advance towards the bridges over the Jordan River.
Before dark, both of them run into very small groups of Israeli infantry. And even though at this point in time they're only a couple of kilometers from their objectives, both brigade commanders decide to stop for the evening, and with almost nothing standing in their way. The bridges were sitting there. They were theirs for the Syrians' taking. When they woke up the next morning, they found strong Israeli forces guarding those 2 bridges.
My battalion met them on the road from the Betecha Valley up to the Golan Heights, The first tanks in our column, they didn't see them. Only the last tank saw them, and he began to shoot. And the commander shouted at him, "Why are you shooting? We are in our territory." He said, "This is Syrians, already here." We didn't believe that they arrived so west. Their problem was that the T-55 have only 5 degrees of degradation.
That means the cannon can't be aimed very far down. It's a disadvantage for a tank on higher ground, engaging an enemy approaching from below. Beyond that, the Israeli shot cows have a high degree of elevation, making it easier to hit targets above them.
They had to expose themselves if they wanted to have enough degradation to shoot at us. So when they expose themselves, we shoot them. So by that way, we succeed to stop them.
The real problem there was simply Syrian junior officers allow small Israeli forces to completely derail the one thing that might have actually secured victory for Syria, the drive to take the Jordan River bridges.
Israeli reserves from the 39th Battalion stopped the Syrian 1st Armored Division at Batea Road. But farther south, the Syrian offensive remains unopposed, as 40 tanks of the 132nd Mechanized Brigade advanced towards the small village of El Al.
I received orders to ascend to El Al and seal up what is known as the El Al position. It's a position between 2 deep canyons, about 2 kilometers wide. He who possesses it and successfully holds the position controls all routes down to the Sea of Galilee. At around 9 o'clock, through my binoculars, I start to identify what we in the armored call masses of dust. This means that you can see the clouds of dust far before you hear the noise. And through the binoculars, I notice some movement from a distance of about 4 kilometers.
That movement in the distance is an entire brigade of Syrian tanks. Their mission is to occupy the western edge of the Golan Heights, overlooking the Sea of Galilee. From here, the flatlands of Israel lie almost undefended and at the mercy of the advancing Syrians.
If they are successful and pass us, the Syrians will be at the Sea of Galilee, and I understand that a loss or even a retreat is not mine alone. It would be fatal.
October 7th, 1973. It is 20 hours into the Syrian attack on the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. And in the rugged and rocky northern sector, 2 Israeli tank units struggle to hold off the Syrians. But in the flatter terrain of the southern Golan, masses of Syrian armor have rolled over the Israelis and are pushing on towards bridges over the Jordan River.
At around 9 o'clock, through my binoculars, I start to identify what we in the armored call masses of dust. This movement ahead becomes clearer and clearer, and then we start to identify Syrian tanks. They are getting closer and are stopping at distances of about 1,500 meters, and we start to notice a lot of strikes. At the plateau of El Al, it's absolutely flat. It's as if they put the tanks on a billiard table and said, "Please, go ahead and play now." You can see huge distances. There is nowhere to hide. And the only thing that can save you is your own capability, your own skill, and to always be on the move. I always make sure that the tanks are always moving and not firing more than what's called a ball to the target, which is just 2 or 3 shells, one after the other. We fire one and then adjust. We fire another and then move to another position. In order to get a target, you'd have to stop and stand. Then you bring the turret to a point where it is in line with the enemy tank. You give the range according to your estimation. When everyone announces on, I give the command to fire.
The Israelis, for their part, maneuvered constantly. They darted from firing position to firing position. Those Syrian armored units didn't maneuver at all. They simply drove straight at the Israelis.
And so this is really the big difference between the Syrian and Israeli armies. The Syrians, when they gain territory, they hang on to it to the death, which might be good, but is very bad if you need to maneuver.
The simple fact is that the Syrian tankers are just no match for the Israeli counterparts. The Israelis have taken the best shots that Syria has to give, and they're now in a position with enough combat strength that they can begin to push back.
So we started to move unit by unit, and I found myself alone in Ramtania. There was 2 hills, and I was in the cradle, you know, of the hills, overlooking Hoshnia village. I saw a regiment getting fueled or rearmed and so on. And I started to shoot at them. And I saw some Syrian tanks leaving the hills. And I started to hit one by one because they were standing one next to the other, very, very close.
The Syrian tanks are sitting ducks for the Israelis' high-explosive squash head, or Hesh round. On impact, they squash against the target and explode. Creating a shock wave that tears apart the inside of the tank.
I think I destroyed something like 7 tanks before they started to move and to understand that somebody is shooting at them. They shot back. Our tank started to bend. As we evacuated from the tank, after a few meters we left the tank, our tank exploded.
The outnumbered Israelis fall back and regroup, and the Syrians gear up for a final big offensive. By late evening on the 8th of October, they've assembled an entire armored division, over 250 tanks in Hoshnia, a tiny hamlet in the South Golan, which is about to become ground zero in one of history's greatest tank battles. Hoshnia, once a thriving village in the southern Golan Heights. Today it's a scattered collection of ruins, a grim monument to the ferocity of the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. Syrian and Israeli tank forces clashed here in a historic encounter, now simply remembered as the Battle of Hoshnia. October 9th. The Syrian advance into the Golan loses steam, and they assemble an armored division, over 250 tanks at Hoshnia, in preparation for a final big offensive. But in the 3 days since Syrian attacks on the Golan Heights began, the Israelis have mobilized hundreds of tanks and thousands of reserve soldiers. Most of them stream towards Hushnia for a showdown with the Syrians.
I received an order to cross the oil pipeline and advance and capture Hashnia. The Syrians held this place as their last stronghold on the Golan Heights. And for the first time since the war began, there was a plan for an organized attack with artillery and jets. The artillery started falling on Hashnia. And we, in 2 squads of tanks, started to advance, crossing the territory from the oil line towards the village of Hashnia. It's dusk, the last light, and you can see the entire village blazing, exploding, and the mosque of Hashnia in the middle of this whole thing. We advanced with the tanks, and the Syrians didn't escape. But it's dangerous, because everything is exploding and blazing around us. It's Dante, it's inconceivable, it's an inferno. And then, from within the village, outburst Syrian tanks and trucks. They are terrified, trying to escape, and I see a Syrian tank, and it isn't clear if it is able to get out. But then, his turret starts moving in my direction, but my cannon and my turret are farther away. And it's completely clear that I won't be able to target him. He's going to get a bead on me first, and if he does, then I'm a goner. Behind me is one of my battalion officers, and he launches a shell, and the Syrian tank lights up. They are difficult displays to describe, but the Syrians ran for their lives.
The Israeli reserves destroy more than 200 tanks, stalling the Syrians' big push. By the afternoon of October 9th, the Israelis have retaken most of the southern Golan. But on the northern front, they are still struggling to hold off Syrian forces in a place that will soon become known as the Valley of Tears.
In the north, the remnants of the elite 7th Armored Brigade are still just barely holding back the Syrian 7th Infantry Division. The Syrians tried one last time to blast through the Israeli positions. They've got 200 tanks, half of them T-62s, and the Israelis are down to less than 30 Centurions.
We are currently located at the positions that control the Valley of Tears, which we see here in front of us. And when I arrive from Booster Ridge with 6 tanks, I realize that I am not going to make it to these positions, which are the best ones, and govern the entire width of the Valley of Tears. By now, Unit 7 has retreated back, and I find myself alone with 6 tanks. And I decide to make a defensive stand on the reverse slope. And I stop the 6 tanks and spread them out along the back slope of the hill that is located behind us. And I see the smoke from the exhaust of the Syrian tanks over the hill. And I tell my men, you, see those moving on the other side of the hill? You, take those 3. You, these 2. You, these 3. And I let the Syrians come right over the hill. I allow the Syrians to advance, and they head towards the top of the hill with the barrel of their cannons pointed upwards. And I wait for them. The battle opens at close range, and around 300 to 400 meters. And we stopped their advance towards the main road. But in this battle, after we stopped the Syrian army, we had only 2 tanks left. On this side, at the foot of Mount Hermonite, we see today the same famous valley where the commander of the 77th Battalion, Colonel Kahalani, stood and blocked the Syrian advance through this valley.
When I came 2 kilometers from the hills, I saw far away Israeli tanks on fire and other tanks around them. It was Syrian tanks. And I moved with my tanks to the valley. I was in shock. I called my commander and said, if you have any tanks in the area, send them immediately.
October 9th, 1973. Israeli and Syrian tank forces had been fighting on the Golan Heights for 3 days, with heavy casualties on both sides. The Syrians outnumbered the Israelis and quickly gained the upper hand. But the Israelis pushed back with their reserve forces. Now time is running out for the Syrian army. They make one last attempt to break through Israeli defenses in the north, throwing an entire armored division into the battle.
They've got 200 tanks, half of them T-62s, and the Israelis are down to less than 30 Centurions.
The main forces is just behind the hill. If they will come to the top of the hills, nobody can stop them. They will run all the way to the Galilee. And I've decided to move forward and to catch the hills and to catch them on the valley.
It's a desperate gambit, and the only chance the Israelis have. They must regain their firing positions. And to do that, they have to cross 800 meters of open ground in the teeth of Syrian fire.
I ordered to move forward like it was written in the book. Nobody moved. And I've decided to move all of them to my frequency, to my radio. Every gunner, loader, driver, and tank commander, sergeant listened to my voice. And I told them, look, the Syrian soldiers, how they're fighting so well. Look at them. The motivation of them. What happened to us? And I see chicken in my unit. Start to move. And I started to move. I saw another tank joined me, another tank joined me. And I prayed to the God, just give me to arrive to the top of the hill, and we will catch them. And suddenly another tanks arrived to the hills. And we arrived. The valley was dark from tanks. We shot like crazy. The moment that we've been on the fire position and they moved on the valley, this was easier for us to shoot all of them. I fought to survive. Some of them, they stopped and they shot and they killed my tanks. We survived around 3-4 tanks, no more than that. I remember that I was trying to count the tank that we shot all over, and I couldn't. So many.
After the battle, Israeli observers counted 500 Syrian tanks destroyed in that defile. And as a result, it came to be called the Valley of Tears for all of the Syrians killed there.
Syria's hope of retaking the Golan Heights ends in the Valley of Tears. On October 11th, the Israelis launched their own offensive into Syria. And on the 23rd, the Syrians capitulate. The battle for the Golan Heights is finally over.
This was simply competent Israeli commanders outthinking, outmoving, outfighting their Syrian opponents. But there's no question that the Syrians fought incredibly hard. They mounted attack after attack after attack into the teeth of ferocious Israeli defenses. And in many cases, they died to a man. This was a no-holds-barred fight, and neither side backed down from it.
The 1973 Arab-Israeli War lasts just 16 days, but those days are among the bloodiest in the history of armored warfare. The battlefields are left littered with the hulks of destroyed tanks. The Israelis lose between 400 and 500. The two Arab countries somewhere between 12 and 2,200. But the real tragedy is in the human cost on both sides. 21,000 dead and tens of thousands more wounded.
Most of my friends I lost during wars. They were 19, 20 years old, no more than that. And I saw them how they fight, and it's unbelievable. And I was very proud.
The war ended with disappointment, but it ended with a solemn promise by Syrians and to Syrians and of Syrians that they will get back the Golan Heights one day. If the Golan Heights is not returned to Syria, I dare say that there will not be peace in the Middle East.